Forecast: A Journey to the Frontiers of Climate Change, from the Amazon to the Arctic, from Darfur to Napa Valley. By Stephan Faris. Narrated by Mel Foster. Copyright 2009 by Stephan Faris. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Henry Holt & Company, LLC, and was produced in the year 2009 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. The first decade of this century will be remembered as the time when the world opened its eyes to climate change. Hurricane Katrina devoured New Orleans. The Amazon erupted in fire. Polar bears drowned in the melting Arctic. Heat waves swept Europe. Drought struck the American Midwest. Glaciers were melting like never before. In 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a coalition of scientists under the banner of the United Nations, declared that 11 out of the previous 12 years had been the hottest on record, and that the warming had almost certainly been caused by emissions from our cars, factories, and power stations, and the clear-cutting of our forests. Later that year, the Climate Change Panel shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. Life on Earth depends on a limited amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Naturally, existing amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, and ozone act like a blanket, trapping the heat from the sun's rays before it radiates back into space. Without them, the average temperature on the planet would be a bitter 2 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. The gases we have added since the Industrial Revolution are acting like an extra blanket, and we're busy piling on more. Since the beginning of the last century, the planet has warmed by roughly 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Before this one is out, the mercury will climb another 2 to 11 degrees. But global warming will mean much more than hotter days. While some places are indeed seeing a rise in temperature, others are getting cooler. In some regions, global warming is clearing the skies of clouds. Elsewhere, it's overtopping the floodgates. Our rapidly changing climate has knocked the world off balance. Natural disasters, hurricanes, droughts, and forest fires are striking harder and more frequently as it struggles to adjust. Nor will the impacts stop with the weather. Each climatic shift has effects that ripple down the causal chain. Droughts kindle competition over water. Heaving oceans put people on the move. Ecosystems shatter as their component species migrate or fail to adapt. This book is about these types of impacts, the rolling series of events that reach beyond the environment and the weather to shape the way we live. In the time I spent on the research and travel for the book, I explored the impacts of our emissions on African refugee camps, Indian border towns, Mediterranean islands, European cities, Arctic outposts, Amazonian colonies, seaside towns on the Gulf Coast, and the vineyards of Napa Valley. What I discovered was that there are places in the world where impacts of the type we can expect from global warming have been experienced for a generation. In Darfur, a lengthy drought has pitted farmers against herders in a brutal conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Stronger hurricanes off the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the United States have made coastal cities more difficult places in which to live. Less alarmingly, increasingly warm summers have been a boon to the world's wine drinkers. Grapes are coming off the vine riper and richer, and with the melting of the Arctic, shippers have begun to consider using polar routes to cut thousands of miles off their trips. So far, much of the discussion about climate change has focused on the distant catastrophic effects of a superheated world: cities deep underwater, frozen continents, the collapse of agricultural regions. But what I found was that even a modest amount of global warming, of the kind we can expect to experience in the next few decades, will be enough to set off dramatic shifts. Changes already underway point to impacts that range from the subtle and sometimes benign to the horrific and potentially catastrophic. In the following chapters, I describe how disruptions in agricultural production can spark fighting, how the risk of fiercer natural disasters can upend coastal living, and how environmental refugees will raise the stakes in the immigration debate. I discuss how diseases will spread and become harder to contain, examine how the changing agricultural landscape will push farmers to adapt, explore how melting ice and failing rains threaten to redraw political boundaries, and look at the ways delicate regions risk slipping into catastrophe. We are already remaking, and will continue to remake, the globe's environment. Yet we don't have to guess at the consequences of a warming world. Its impacts lie just around the corner. The future of our planet can be found now on the frontiers of climate change. Chapter 1. Things will break loose from the hands of the wise men. Darfur, Scarcity, and Conflict. In 1985, with the Darfur region of Sudan deep in drought, a doctoral candidate named Alex Deval met with a bedridden and nearly blind Arab sheik named Hilal Abdallah. The elderly nomad and his tribesmen had pitched their camp across an unforgiving wasteland of rock and sand. Broad black tents rose like sails against the rough horizon. Thorn trees broke ground at lonesome intervals, sparse grazing for the tribe's camels. The student was long-limbed and gangly, bent forward with the eagerness of youth. The sheik, tall, stately, stooped by age, asked him in. His tent was hung with the paraphernalia of a lifetime's nomadism: water jars, saddles, spears, swords, leather bags, and an old rifle, Deval recalled years later. He invited me to sit opposite him on a fine Persian rug, summoned his retainer to serve sweet tea on a silver platter, and told me the world was coming to an end. They dined on goat and rice and ate with their hands. Deval was studying indigenous reactions to the dryness that gripped the region. The elderly nomad described things he had never seen before. Sand blew over fertile lands. The rare rain washed away alluvial soil. Farmers who had once hosted his tribe and his camels were now blocking their migration. The land could no longer support herder and planter both. Many of the sheik's tribesmen had lost their stock and scratched at millet farming, relegated to sandy soil between plots of fertile land. With his stick, the nomad sketched a grid in the sand, a chessboard Deval understood to be the moral geography of the region. The farmers tended to their crops in the black squares, and the sheik's people stuck to the white, cutting without conflict like chessboard bishops through the fields. The drought had changed all that. The God-given order was broken, the sheik said, and he feared the future. The way the world was set up since time immemorial was being disturbed, recalled Deval, now a program director at the Social Science Research Council. And it was bewildering, depressing, and the consequences were terrible. Nearly 20 years later, when a new scourge swept across Darfur, Deval would remember the meeting. Janjaweed fighters in military uniforms, mounted on camels and horses, laid waste to the region. In a campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting the region's blacks, the armed militiamen raped women, burned houses, and tortured and killed men of fighting age. Through whole swaths of Darfur they left only smoke curling into the sky. At their head was a 6'4" Arab with an athletic build and a commanding presence. In a conflict the United States would call genocide, he topped the State Department's list of suspected war criminals. Deval recognized him. His name was Musa Hilal, and he was the sheik's son. On the path from worried elder to militant son lie the roots of a conflict that has forced 2 million mostly black Africans from their homes and killed between 200,000 and 450,000 people. The fighting in Darfur is usually described as racially motivated, pitting mounted Arabs against black rebels and civilians. But the distinction between Arab and black African in Darfur is defined more by lifestyle than by any physical difference. Arabs are generally herders, Africans typically farmers. The two groups are not racially distinct. Both are predominantly Muslim. The fault lines have their origins in another distinction between settled farmers and nomadic herders fighting over failing lands. The aggression of the warlord Musa Hilal, forged in a time of desertification, drought, and famine, can be traced to the fears of his father and to how climate change shattered a way of life. I first visited the region in the spring of 2004 when I traveled to the town of Adre on the eastern edge of Chad and drove 3 hours south along the Darfurian border. Refugees had been crossing the dry riverbed that formed the frontier and provided the area with its only source of water. It was early morning when I followed a group of women and their mules down into its dry sands. The rising sun made contrails from the dust at their feet. The vegetation was low and scrubby. The women dug broad holes into the bed of the river and pulled out brownish water with plastic jugs. It was dangerous work. The Janjaweed were still active on the other side, and had been watering their horses and camels nearby. While their violence was mostly confined to Darfur, the militia had begun to launch cross-border raids in search of cattle that had escaped their assault. The women had nearly filled their water barrels when 2 new arrivals dropped from the brush on the far side and fell to their knees in Muslim prayer. They were both women in their 50s, prematurely wrinkled and bent by sun and poverty. When they rose, I asked one to tell me her story. Halim Hassan Osman and her companion had left Chad the night before, risking discovery to return to Darfur and dig in the ruins of their village. They had spent the day in fear, hiding in the bush, too terrified to eat or pray, and returned after another night of fretful walking. The only thing they had found to salvage was a few handfuls of grain and beans. It had been a rough journey, and it seemed strange to me that these 2 grandmothers had been chosen for the mission. "If the men go, they will kill them," Halim answered. "If it's a young woman, they rape her. That's why it's us, the old women, who go see." The refugees were camped in the high ground just inside Chad, in makeshift shelters of bent reeds and woven grass among the mud houses of a nearby village. On the wall of the local dispensary, the community's only concrete building, children had used charcoal to draw crude sketches of men in machine guns and planes dribbling bombs. A 55-year-old man named Bilal Abdul Karim Ibrahim showed me where he had been shot twice while saving his daughters from being raped. I said, "I will die. I cannot let you rape my girls in front of me." His attackers had tied a cord around his testicles and pulled, beating his wife when she tried to cut him loose. He only escaped when an older white-bearded militiaman ordered his release. Fatum Isaac Zakaria, a young girl, was 7 months pregnant when she and 3 others were raped during an attack on her village. "We didn't want to go with them," she said. "They beat us all the way into the forest. They said, 'You are the wives of the rebels.' They insulted us. They said, 'You are slaves.' That night, as I was leaving, I saw flames rising from inside Sudan. They glowed for about 10 minutes, then faded away. It was the Janjaweed, the refugees told me, torching the last of their homes. Until the rains began to fail, the Sheik's people had lived amicably with the settled farmers. The nomads were welcome passers through, grazing their camels on the rocky hillsides that separated the fertile plots. The farmers would share their wells, and the herders would feed their stock on the leavings from the harvest. But with the drought, the nomads ranged farther for their food, and the farmers began to fence off their land, even fallow land, for fear it would be ruined by passing herds. Sometimes they'd burn the grass upon which the animals fed. A few tribes drifted elsewhere or took up farming, but the camel-herding Arabs stuck to their fraying livelihoods. Nomadic herding was central to their cultural identity. The name Darfur means land of the Fur, called so for the largest single tribe of farmers in the region. But the vast region holds the homelands, the Dars, of many tribes. In the late 1980s, landless and increasingly desperate Arabs banded together to wrest their own Dar from the black farmers, publishing in 1987 a manifesto of racial superiority. It began with complaints of underrepresentation in the government, and concluded with a threat to take matters into their own hands. We fear that if this neglect of the participation of the Arab race continues, things will break loose from the hands of the wise men to those of the ignorant, leading to matters of grave consequences. Clashes had broken out between the Fur and camel-herding Arabs, and in the 2 years before an uneasy peace was signed in 1989, 3,000 people, mostly Fur, were killed, and hundreds of villages and nomadic camps were burnt. More fighting in the 1990s entrenched the divisions between Arabs and non-Arabs, pitting the pastoralists against the Fur, Zagawa, and Masalite, the 3 tribes that would later form the bulk of the rebellion against the central government. In these disputes, Khartoum often supported the Arabs politically. Sometimes, in an attempt to create a bulwark against revolutionaries from southern Sudan, the government provided arms. When a rebellion began in Darfur in 2003, it was at first a reaction against Khartoum's neglect and political marginalization of the region. But while the rebels initially sought a pan-ethnic front against a distant, uncaring regime, the schism between those who opposed the government and those who supported it soon broke largely on ethnic lines. The camel-herding Arabs became Khartoum's staunchest stalwarts. Nomadic Arab militia launched a brutal campaign to push the black farmers from Darfur. They wore military uniforms, sometimes drove military vehicles, and coordinated their attacks with Sudanese aerial bombing. Even so, the conflict was rooted more in land envy than in ethnic hatred. Some of the Arab pastoral tribes, particularly the camel herders, did not have their own dar, so were always at the mercy of other tribes for land, said David Mazursky, the International Crisis Group's project director for the Horn of Africa. This was fine for hundreds of years, since the system provided land for these groups as they moved. But as desertification worsened, and as fertile land decreased, some of these pastoralists sought to have their own land, which wasn't really an option in Darfur. This was one of the main factors that Khartoum used to manipulate and mobilize these Arab tribes to join the Janjaweed and fight on their side. Interestingly, most of the Arab tribes who have their own land rights did not join the government's fight. I returned to Chad later that year to the refugee camp of Ure Kasoni, 170 miles north of Adre, into the advancing desert. By then, the countryside on the other side of the border had been nearly depopulated. Most of those who were arriving had spent weeks fleeing the Janjaweed, seeking refuge in the hills, following the grass and water, trying to hold on to the last of their livestock before they finally lost them and headed for the border. Ure Kasoni was a place you'd go to only when you had nothing left. The surrounding desert was flat and featureless, cut by broad, shallow rivers that flooded when it rained and dried when it didn't. The trees spread out for water, low, thorny scrubs separated by wind-carved sand. Between them nothing grew, not even dry grass. The horizon unfolded in a shallow arc, as if at sea. Dust devils spun themselves out against the noontime heat. The evenings blew in sandstorms from Darfur. They reared up as if to block the sun, turned everything sepia, then whipped down, leaving tents flattened and torn. The nearest inhabitation, Bahai, was a run-down border town south of the camp, a scattering of concrete block compounds with a population far smaller than its new northern neighbor. Bahai is a terrible place for a camp. Tim Burrows, the environmental health officer for the International Rescue Committee, which was running the operation, told the Christian Science Monitor. It's where the Sahara begins. There are plenty of dunes. You see houses overtaken by sand. You see villages abandoned. Groundwater was scarce. Aid workers drew water from a murky artificial lake at the border with Darfur, just 3 miles from the camp. Rebels were staged nearby and were rumored to be filling up their water tanks at the treatment center. In 50 years, Burrows said, the area would likely be unable to sustain life. The latest arrivals from Darfur had gathered outside the camp to wait for admission. The men wore robes of white or gray. The women were dressed in the incongruous colors of spring flowers. In the early morning the refugees would tend to their mule, if they had one, and arrange their belongings, if they had any. Everything slowed with the climbing sun. I moved from one group to another. The thorn-shaped leaves of the low trees offered little protection against the heat, so the refugees draped the branches with rugs, woven plastic mats, and empty rice bags. A small tree might shelter 4 or 5 people. No square inch of shade was wasted. A 65-year-old grandmother named Mariam Omar Abdu had fled from her burning village 3 months earlier. She had watched from the bushes as men in military clothes shot 3 of her grandchildren. Their bodies were left where they fell. "We feared for ourselves," she said. "They killed our children. We feared the same would happen to us." She had watched as soldiers tied up 3 men from her village, beat them, loaded them on a truck, and drove them away. Zahara Abdul Karim, a woman holding a small child, had large eyes with brows that curled up in a natural frown of concern. Her skin was smooth and unusually dark. Her robes were black. She had awoken one morning to the buzz of planes overhead, the bark of bombs from the far side of her village, and the rush of flames from inside her home. She ran out into her mud-walled courtyard and into the arms of the Janjaweed. One had a knife and one had a whip. Both wore military uniforms. As they forced her to the ground, she saw her husband's body lying in the dirt. One held her while the other raped her. They called her a dog and a donkey, and when they were finished, the man with the knife slashed deep across her thigh, a few inches above the knee. The mark signified slavery, they told her. She had been branded like a camel. They wanted to replace this black skin with Arabs, she said. Her analysis was echoed by the findings of Brent and Jan Fundheller, retired law enforcement officers, who had spent a month in the camps conducting more than 1,000 interviews in an attempt to quantify human rights violations for the United States State Department. Men as well as women had been raped with sticks and rifle barrels, and threatened with more of the same if they didn't leave. One of the most common was, "If you like this, stay in Sudan. If you don't like this, go to Chad," said Jan. The attackers usually killed the men and boys, but allowed the women and girls to escape. Children were torn from their mothers' arms and checked for gender. They'd take a girl, throw her to the ground, said Brent. They'd take a boy, stab him. It takes a long time to make another generation of fighting age. Nobody was safe. The Janjaweed burned mosques and killed religious leaders. In one village, they burned 5 black imams alive. In another, invaders took a Koran from the mosque, threw it to the ground, and urinated on it. Men were killed at prayer, and one imam and his son were raped, then taken away. "We've worked in Bosnia and Kosovo, so there are certain things you expect," said Jan. But I was shocked by the scope of the tragedy. Why did Darfur's lands fail? For much of the 1980s and 1990s, environmental degradation in Sudan and other parts of the Sahel, the semi-arid region just south of the Sahara, was blamed on the inhabitants. The dramatic decline in rainfall between the last 40 years and the previous 40 was attributed to mistreatment of the region's vegetation by the local population. Deforestation and overgrazing, the dominant theory went, exposed more rock and sand, which absorb less sunlight than plants, instead reflecting it back toward space. This cooled the air near the surface, drawing clouds downward, reducing the chance of rain, and continuing the cycle. Africans were said to be doing it to themselves, said Isaac Held, a senior scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But by the time of the Darfur conflict, scientists had identified another cause. Climatologists fed historical sea surface temperatures into a variety of computer models of atmospheric change. What they discovered was that rising temperatures in the tropical and southern oceans, combined with cooling in the North Atlantic, was enough to disrupt the African monsoons and produce the changes in the weather that had been recorded. The degradation of Darfur's lands was a consequence, not a cause, of the drop in rainfall. This was not caused by people cutting trees or overgrazing, said Columbia University's Alessandra Giannini, who led one of the analyses. The roots of the drying of Darfur, she and her colleagues had found, lay in changes to the global climate. To what extent those changes can be blamed on human activities remains an open question. Hurricanes rely on a similar pattern of warming, said Giannini. Just as it's possible to trace global warming through rising ocean temperatures to strengthening storms without being able to conclusively link a particular hurricane to increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so it is with Darfur. Scientists agree that greenhouse gases have warmed the tropical and southern oceans, and evidence indicates that sulfate aerosols from industrial pollution kept the North Atlantic cooler. But just how much man-made causes, as opposed to natural drifts in oceanic temperatures, are responsible for the drought that struck Darfur is as debatable as the relationship between global warming and the destruction of New Orleans. Nobody can say that Hurricane Katrina was definitely caused by climate change, said Peter Schwartz, the co-author of a 2003 Pentagon report on climate change and national security. But we can say that climate change means more Katrinas. For any single storm, as with any single drought, it's difficult to say. But we can say we'll get more big storms and more severe droughts. Darfur may be a canary in the coal mine, a foretaste of climatically driven political chaos. Even mild climatic shifts over the past 1,000 years, the kinds that have occurred naturally, seem to have the power to spark conflict. David Zhang, a professor at the University of Hong Kong, scoured China's dynastic archives for records of war and rebellion and compared them with the historical temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere as gleaned from analysis of tree rings, coral, boreholes, and ice cores. In the span between the 11th and 20th centuries, Zhang and his colleagues counted 15 periods of intense fighting. All but 3 of them occurred in the decades immediately following extended periods of unusual cold. The most dramatic peak in warfare occurred when China, and Europe, was plunged into the Little Ice Age. At the time, globally, you see a very, very sad situation, said Zhang. In Europe, you had the 17th century crisis, you had the 30 Years' War. In China, Zhang had found, cooling temperatures reduced agricultural yields, leading to famine, rebellion, and war. We also found that dynastic collapses also followed the oscillating temperature cycles over the past millennium, Zhang wrote in the scientific journal Human Ecology. Almost all of the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?